Many thanks for joining us on Business Incorporated. I am Bisi Adebayo. On the show today, President Muhammadu Buhari signs into law the revised 2020 budget. Conflict and climate change forcing millions in spiral of poverty. And Botswana is now rationing fuel amid a shortage. Well, let's begin the program right here in Nigeria as the president signs into law the revised 2020 budget following the passage of the bill by the National Assembly in June. The National Assembly had passed the revised budget of 10.8 trillion naira sent to it by the president to reflect the current economic realities caused by the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic and falling oil prices. During the signing today, President Buhari explains that ministries, departments and agencies will be given 50% of their capital allocation by the end of this month. And time to hit the markets now. It looks like a green day for the markets here in Nigeria and South Africa. The NSE index was up 0.09% at intraday, and the JSE index was also up 0.13%. The markets in Egypt is closed today, but ended negative on Thursday. Kenya also closed negative on Thursday. And markets in the Middle East are closed on Friday, but sentiments were mixed on Thursday, which was the last trading day for the week, with the Qatari index gaining the most by 0.99%. Saudi Arabia's stock market lost 0.02%. Elsewhere in the UAE, the Abu Dhabi index eased 0.38%, and it was hurt by a 0.7% fall in Emirates Telecommunications and a 3.7% decline in Waha Capital, while Dubai's main share index slipped 0.05% at intraday. And in Europe, markets erased early losses on Friday, but remained muted as concerns about spiking coronavirus cases in the U.S. and elsewhere continue to weigh on the broad recovery rally. Well, let's bring in Conrad Bosin for details. Good afternoon, Conrad. On the last day of the trading week in Frankfurt, equities look rather shaky again. What's the performance of the German index in the course of this week?
Well, at the moment, Jimmy, the German index DAX is trading more or less on the same level where it was last Friday. So in the course of this trading week, no big change. But as you said, it was a very shaky week. Many stocks were pretty volatile. We saw many very strong upswings and downswings of individual stocks. And I'm afraid that's also what traders are predicting for next week, because the earnings season is only going to get into gear a little bit later. So a few companies next week who might have extraordinary numbers, extraordinarily good or extraordinarily bad, might decide to release them before the scheduled date, already next week, but the bulk of earnings report is expected a little later. Thursday comes along with a council meeting of the European Central Bank, so get prepared for some monetary policy talk and speculation. And keep an eye on China. The stock market there has reached the highest level in 5 years. This week alone, $1 trillion worth was added to the equity market in Shanghai. If you ask me, this smells a lot like a bubble. And in those nervous corona times, I guess that bubbles are easily to burst.
All right, Conrad, let me just let you know that you're speaking with Bissy here. But moving on now, the International Monetary Fund urges equity-like government support for virus-hit firms, and the fund's chief economist says government should focus less on loans for companies. What's the problem with loans?
The IMF says that the shock of the corona lockdowns and the recession that came along with it was so big that we have to get ready to see many companies go bankrupt, go insolvent. And the problem now is that if you give loans to companies, which means also that they have to pay interest, that puts a burden on companies. It's like an extra tax, the IMF says, and that should be avoided in this situation where many businesses are, who try to just, pull themselves out of the deep, deep holes that they have plunged into. Of course, if the governments invested more directly in company equity, this immediately also would trigger the discussion about zombie firms, companies that already before the crisis were on the brink of collapse. Who is to decide who to support and who to invest in? So maybe this discussion is a little bit academic. It would be very difficult to convince taxpayers that governments should, on a large scale, invest in companies to save them.
In a surprise vote, Conrad, the finance ministers of the Eurozone have chosen Irish finance minister to lead the bloc's financial policy making arm, which is the Eurogroup. Why was that surprise, and what are the implications?
Well, the surprise was there because most people in the Eurozone had expected Nadia Calviño, the Spanish Minister for Economics, to become the new Eurogroup chief, because she also had the backing of the big players of Germany, of France, of Italy, and of course Spain. But it turns out that, like it always or very often happens, the small member countries of the Eurogroup were not at all happy with the fact that the big players had already before the vote negotiated and settled on Nadia Calviño. And we shouldn't forget, she once called the smaller member countries of Northern Europe, like, the Netherlands, the Baltics, Belgium, very small countries with very little weight. And that, of course, at the time was perceived to be very condescending and arrogant, something that Pascal Donoghue, the new chief of the Eurogroup, the finance minister of Ireland, is said to be absolutely not. No arrogance, a very outgoing person, somebody who would be ready to build bridges. That is something the Eurozone, the Eurogroup needs. So it came as a surprise, but it was welcomed by many people here in Frankfurt.
All right, Conrad, thanks for those updates, and do have a wonderful weekend. Meantime, now Moody's says the UK faces the sharpest peak to GDP contraction in G20. Well, let's see if that is moving the London markets this intraday, and Juliana will tell us more about this. Good afternoon, Juliana. So it's you and I again. Well, Moody's has said it expects to see the UK GDP contract 10.1% this year, and a sharper contraction than any other G20 economy, and so many projections for the UK economy. Does Moody's forecast matter now, and what are the market numbers saying?
Good afternoon, Bissy. Always happy to spend some time with you. But Moody's forecast is very similar, actually, to what we heard from the OECD a couple of weeks ago, which is that Britain will be the worst affected, economically speaking, of all the G20 nations. And that's really down to the fact that Britain is a service-based economy. They rely heavily upon the restaurant and the hospitality sector, as well as tourism. That's completely been at a standstill for nearly 4 months. So there's no surprises as to why they would be the worst affected. Also, if you compare us to many of our European counterparts, we went into lockdown much later. And of course, consequently, we're coming out much later. And another red herring, another major issue when it comes to Britain's COVID recovery is, of course, Brexit. We are hoping that we will be able to secure a deal before it gets to the autumn. But crashing out of the EU bloc without a deal is becoming increasingly likely. And if you think of the economic shock of Brexit, as well as recovering from the COVID-19, there are no surprises as to why Moody's have given this 10% drop in GDP rating. Has it affected the markets? Not really. I believe traders have already factored that in a couple of weeks ago. We do have a rally in the energy market sector. Yesterday, of course, Ofgem tried to put forward this piece of legislation which would cripple the revenues from some of these big energy giants. But once the dust has settled, it appears as if investors are seeking their money or putting their money back into them. And intraday, the all-share is up 0.63%. The FTSE 100 is up by 0.52%. And the FTSE 250 is up by 1.25%. In the currencies market, the pound is up against the US dollar by 0.04%, up against that same amount on the euro, and also up against the Japanese yen by 0.34%.
OK, Juliana. Now, the UK regulator Ofcom has fined Royal Mail £1.5 million for missing its first-class delivery targets in 2018 to 2019. What will this mean for this company? Now, don't forget that Royal Mail was also hit with a £100,000 fine for overcharging customers for second-class stamps between 25th of March and March the 31st last year.
Yes, they have been. What happens is that when it comes to first-class post, which is basically sending a letter on Monday and it being delivered to somebody on Tuesday, when Ofcom looked at the figures on 2018-2019, Royal Mail fell short of that. So you're supposed to have a threshold of 93%. I believe they delivered 91.5%. You are able to appeal these decisions, but on appeal, the regulator said that the reason and the excuse that Royal Mail gave was unsatisfactory. So they have been given this £1 million fine. And then, as you said, during a certain period, I believe the regulator put a threshold of how much you could be charging for second-class stamps. I believe at the time it was 60 pence. For a week after that legislation was passed, Royal Mail were charging customers 61 pence from that revenue. In that week, they raised £60,000. It was against regulation, so they also received a £100,000 fine.
All right, Juliana, it's the end of the week. So wrap up the week for us, plus an outlook for next week.
Well, next week is a heavy data week. We're expecting UK GDP figures on Tuesday for the month of May. In the month of April, UK GDP fell by a record-breaking 20.4%. It's still going to be a contraction in GDP, but it won't be as much as we had seen in April. I believe estimates are between 10 and 13%. And if those forecasts are right, then the Q2 GDP contraction of about 15% is on target, which would be an historic low. We're also expecting inflation data. Inflation has been well beyond what the Bank of England have set. So we are going to be expecting that. And also unemployment figures are expected next week. At the moment, unemployment in the UK stands at about 3.9%. It's likely to rise perhaps by 0.1 or 0.2%. And I've got to tell you, it is the UK busy, so weather does play a major part. We've actually had pretty bad weather in the UK over the past couple of days. It has been raining, but as soon as the weather's out, the Brits do love to flock to the streets. So perhaps the footfall we saw last weekend, which was, you know, pretty underwhelming when the hospitality sector opened, could be increased this weekend, tomorrow, in fact, once the sun puts his hat on.
We'll see how all that goes, Juliana. Plus, it also been raining here. But anyway, enjoy your weekend, and we'll see you again next week. We'll take a moment now, and we'll return in just a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back. In a bid to ease a crippling shortage that has seen some consumers rush to stock up, Botswana has started rationing fuel. Long queues formed in recent weeks at fuel stations in the country's capital as some run dry. Shortages have disrupted businesses and threatened to increase the woes of an economy already expected to shrink 13% this year. But the president says that sales will be limited to the value of 250 pula worth of fuel, although the limit will not apply to frontline workers and public transport operators. The southern African country, which consumes about 3.3 million litres a day, normally keeps reserves at 12 days' supply. It has lifted a lockdown imposed to contain the coronavirus, but its borders remain closed, with only essential imports allowed and truckers tested for the virus and quarantined before they enter. And back here, frontline consumer goods company Dangote Sugar Refinery has taken over the operations of Savannah Sugar in a bid to achieve a backward integration in the commodity market. This follows the consent of the shareholders at a court-ordered and extraordinary general meeting, which was preceded by the approval of a total of 13.2 billion naira worth of dividend for the 2019 calendar year.
Shareholders of Dangote Sugar Refinery here via proxies to deliberate on a plethora of resolutions in 3 different meetings comprising the 14th annual meeting, an extraordinary general meeting, and a court-ordered meeting on the acquisition of Savannah Sugar. First off is the annual general meeting where shareholders unequivocally approved the impressive financial reports for the 2019 calendar year, one that the chairman, Mr. Aliko Dangote, attributes to the land border closure.
So closure of the border really helped us. It is also true that, yes, sales went up, but revenue went down because the smuggled sugar really affected us. Thank you.
Next is the extraordinary general meeting where investors approved the creation of 3 billion new ordinary shares of 50 kobo each and increased the authorized share capital from 6 billion naira to 7.5 billion naira.
Ladies and gentlemen,
having deliberated on the scheme of arrangements between the two companies, it's time for the court-ordered meeting. Here, shareholders authorized the takeover of cane sugar production company, Savannah Sugar.
One is a farming company. They also have refining operations within those plantations. And the expertise, which was really initially domiciled in Lagos at the refinery here, would now be overseeing more effectively.
That then means that there will be raw materials for the production of both industrial sugar and consumable sugar. So that has given us hope.
Following the acquisition, Dangote Sugar Refinery believes that it's on track to boost backward integration in the sugar industry.
The refinery will import the raw sugar and produce. This other one, we are actually growing the sugar locally and also producing it all integrated. So I think going forward, it will make us to concentrate and do much better. Our target is that in the next 4 or 5 years to reach something like about 600,000 metric tons of sugar, domestically.
With this historic business combination, all eyes will be on Dangote Sugar Refinery's next financial results, as investors hope the marriage will help reduce pressure on the naira.
Meanwhile, the COVID-19 lockdown has prompted some Nigerians to turn to farming for an additional source of income. Local technology startup Beat Drone, which saw an increase in the number of farmers reaching out to use its drones to spray pesticides, hopes to tap into the needs of both experienced and novice farmers in the wake of the pandemic.
Abidemi Olaja thought her business that sells seedlings and sets up home gardens in Nigeria's commercial capital, Lagos, would shrivel when the COVID-19 pandemic struck. But then the orders started pouring in. Customers, she said, were scared of taking regular trips to the market that would likely expose them to the virus. She had valid reasons to be worried. After more than 1 year of being in the business, she barely had over 3 orders in a week. But surprisingly for her, during the lockdown and until now, her deliveries moved up to 20 orders a day.
I can remember when COVID-19 started, I was so depressed. I was like, nobody's going to order for my seedlings again. In fact, I can remember there was a day I was crying. I was so sad about it. And lo and behold, when the lockdown started, the request for my seedlings, it's multiplied to about 100%. It was like really more and overwhelming, and I didn't used to have a whole lot of seedlings, so it has kept me more busy. Like each day I find something to do. I have to keep planting every day to be able to meet up.
Some Nigerians have ventured into farming on bigger plots rather than working on their home gardens. Veronica Kibu, a civil servant 5 years away from retirement, said she and her husband decided to spend more time and money on expanding their groundnut farm in Nigeria's capital, Abuja, since the new coronavirus started spreading there.
Because of the coronavirus that has happened, my eyes have opened widely. So this thing has made me now, I've decided that I will not leave farming. I said by the grace of God, I will continue to farm until even when I retire.
To help reduce its dependency on oil, Africa's most populous country is pushing for more people to take up agriculture, which currently contributes about 40% of its gross economic output. But the sector is wrought with poor infrastructure and electricity, amongst other challenges, making agriculture less attractive to many. Some technology firms are seeking to offer farming solutions at a time when restrictions on the movement of workers and social distancing is working against any desire to increase output. Nigerian startup BitDrone, founded by Confident Odionye, is helping large-scale farmers spray pesticides in their farms using drones instead of backpacks.
The aim was simply to ensure that we increase efficiency in the agricultural sector and reduce the cost of operation and also improve harvest yield in the agricultural sector in Nigeria, which has been plagued by massive loss of crops at harvest period.
A government report on the impacts of the outbreak indicates that 39.4 million people, about a third of Nigeria's workforce, may become unemployed by the end of this year.
And now the explosive mix of escalating conflict and devastating climate change is endangering the lives of millions of people, with the latest report from the International Committee of the Red Cross and Red Crescent showing that the majority of countries most vulnerable to global warming are caught in fighting. Let's see this report.
An ICRC report published on Thursday, July 9th, says that out of 20 countries most vulnerable to climate change, 60% are living in conflict zones. And unless urgent action is taken to mitigate the effects of global warming, 200 million people will need international humanitarian aid by 2050, double the 2018 figure. The report focused on Mali, the Central African Republic, and Iraq. Niger, too, which borders with Mali, Burkina Faso, and Nigeria, where attacks are spiraling, illustrates the stress on herders who have lost land and access to water and forced thousands away from their homes in search of better grazing conditions and fleeing violence. The ICRC carried out an inculcation campaign in February this year in parts of Niger to help herders fight disease and maintain their cattle, but violence makes many of these regions inaccessible to those trying to change agricultural methods. The ICRC report says 1/3 of the world's cropland has been abandoned in the past 40 years because of erosion. Each year, an additional 20 million hectares of agricultural land either becomes too degraded for crop production or lost to urbanization. It also quotes the United Nations figure that over 50% of the world's population is expected to be in stressed regions by 2050.
With climate change, you know there is not enough fodder, and the animals are concentrated in just one area.
The ICRC policy advisor, Catherine Grayson, says climate action is urgently needed in the vulnerable zones where conflict is displacing farmers and herders.
Climate change will be felt everywhere, but its most crippling effects will be borne by the world's most vulnerable communities, and this includes those entering conflicts. Yet these communities are among those most neglected by climate action.
They're calling for urgent actions to help fight climate degradation and reach conflict zones to ensure that communities hit hardest get the support they need to adapt.
And that's where we end today's program. Thank you for watching. I am BC Adebayo.